Okay, morning everyone. I think we're going to make a start, if that's good for everyone who's joining us. So a really big welcome to this session from me. My name's Nick Whittaker. I am one of Her Majesty's inspectors from Ofsted, and I'm also Ofsted's specialist advisor for SEN and disability, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you this morning for this session. I'm just going to start by going through a few technicalities, so I hope this is going to be helpful, and then after that, really brief introduction, we'll crack on with the session. So there's just one slide here summarising a few things for this session. We're really hoping that all of the technology works, but if it doesn't for any reason, please bear with us. Please be patient, and we'll do our very best to sort it out. There are quite a number of you signed up for this session, which is great. What that means practically is that you'll remain muted for the session. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But in practice, what it means that if you want to ask a question during the webinar or at the end of the webinar, the best way to do that is in the question box, and I will do my best to pick up on questions as we go through the session. It may not be possible to answer all of the questions during the session, in which case I believe that everything is stored and I'll pick them up afterwards and get back to you separately. So I'm hoping that will work. I'm hoping that will work well, and I think Helen has joined us today for this session to answer any technical questions and to pick up on things that are practical things about access to slides and things like that. So I hope that is all going to work smoothly for us. I've actually just got 3 slides that I want to share with you in this session, but a number of different things that I'd like to talk about in the time that we've got together. The first of those 3 things is the work that Ofsted and CQC have been doing in this interim period. So during this period of time when our routine inspection work is paused, and in particular what I'd like to focus on is what we have been learning from our interim visits to local areas. So we visited 6 areas this term, and I want to tell you about what we've done, how we've done it, and what we've learned. I thought it might also be helpful to talk briefly about our plans for restarting area send inspections, and then use a bigger chunk of the time that we've got together to focus on the work that we're doing on the new area send inspection framework. So our future plans for this work. I think it's important to say at this point that those 3 things are connected. So a good example of that is that some of the things that we're thinking will be important in the new area send inspection framework, we've been starting to think about in our interim visits and test out some different ways of working. So I can say a little bit more about those. Quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this session is summarised in a commentary that Amanda Spielman, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, published on the 9th of July, and that's available on the .gov website, and I'm happy to share links with that if that would be helpful. But you may also have heard Amanda talking yesterday about our long-standing concerns about the SEND system in England at the launch of her 4th annual report yesterday. So let's move on to the first slide. So I guess the starting point for me today is to remind you that our inspections with CQC have 2 main purposes. Our job in inspecting area send arrangements under the current framework is to provide an independent evaluation of how well an area is fulfilling its duties in relation to children and young people with SEND. And our inspections have two purposes. One, in the way that we do that, to hold leaders in a local area to account, but also to assist them in improving and developing the local SEND system. And it's important to keep in mind, I think, those two dimensions of inspection as supporting improvement and inspection as holding leaders in partnerships to account. So a bit of background, again, because I think this is important in understanding how we go forward with these inspections in Ofsted and CQC. You'll probably know that since May 2016, when we first started inspecting area SEND, we've inspected 117 local areas in England. About half of these areas were required to produce and submit a written statement of action to HMCI as a result of the significant weaknesses that inspection teams identified. And it goes without saying that proportion is much too high. In the last 2 years, we have revisited 21 of the areas where we had previously identified significant weaknesses to assess the progress that those areas have made in tackling the weaknesses that inspectors found. And looking across those 21 revisits, about 2/3 of the things that really weren't working well in those areas have been tackled. But of course, what that does mean is that about a third of the things that me and my colleagues had identified as not working well haven't been tackled sufficiently well during this time. So in that period between the main inspection and the revisit, and that's usually about that has been about 2 years. So what I think we can say is that despite the expertise and commitment of our colleagues working in the SEND system in England, we do still see many problems in the way it's working. A few examples that I hope will be helpful. So firstly, many of those areas, the 21 that we've revisited, needed to address a weakness in strategic leadership in their partnership. And all but one of those areas had been successful to some degree in addressing that weakness. Many of those areas came from a very low starting point with real, very fundamental weaknesses in the leadership of the area's SEND arrangements. That was a common theme. And in some cases, where there'd been greatest progress, the inspection team that revisited those areas could see that there'd been a change in culture and that there were higher ambitions for children and young people with SEND. And the most successful areas had really tackled some very entrenched attitudes and had created clearer lines of accountability. So it was clear who was responsible for the experience of children and young people with SEND and their families and the outcomes they were achieving. We could also see in these areas where there'd been more success that partnership working and collaboration had been strengthened. But equally, we could see that in other areas that work had taken a considerable time. So it was heading in the right direction, but it had taken a long time. And I guess one of my reflections on that would be that perhaps it's not a surprise that there is this strong correlation between the effectiveness of leadership in a local area and the area's success in addressing the weaknesses that we previously identified. But nevertheless, I think it's important to make that point. A really essential point that I want to make today is that some of those areas, again, where there'd been there have been bigger impact overall, had been more successful in tackling weaknesses in their approach to working with families. We saw, and I'm not just saying this because I'm speaking to you here today, we've said this in the annual report very clearly, that we have seen in areas where there's been more success that the role of the parent and carer forum has been really prominent, and that forums and other parent and carer groups have been involved meaningfully in planning and decision making at a strategic level, and that involvement has really given voice to the views and experiences of parents and carers, children and young people themselves. What we've also said in the annual report, and again, I would say to you, this is a really crucial point, is that where practice in working with parents and carers, children and young people, was strongest, it was clear to us that leaders had understood that co-production means working with families as equal partners. But again, what we could also see from those visits is that there is still significant work to be done. You will recognise that from your areas, and in some cases, although there was some enthusiasm and keenness and an ambition to work collaboratively, we saw examples where co-production with parents and carers had faltered, and worryingly, other examples where that had been done in a tokenistic way. Thirdly, we have seen some examples of areas tackling weaknesses in joint commissioning. You know, something that is really part of the kind of engine room of the 2014 reforms. But this was an area where generally local areas had made less progress, and in almost every case, that was a result of leaders not having an accurate understanding of the views, the needs, the experience of children and young people with SEND and their families. You know, it's such an essential starting point when you're making decisions about what services to commission, how to commission them, how to plan them, provide them, monitor, evaluate their effectiveness and impact. And we saw strong evidence in revisits where that wasn't working well, that it really hampered the local area's ability to commission the right services in a child-centred and properly needs-led way. Again, you'll recognise the fourth area, and I'm sure you'll recognise this, is that the quality of education, health and care plans in the areas that we have revisited has remained a concern to us. And a couple of examples of that, the quality and the integration of the advices from education, health and care professionals, we're still seeing is not consistent enough. And we are still seeing in areas that too often there aren't effective systems in place for checking the quality of draft and finalised education, health and care plans. We've seen in increasing numbers annual reviews not being completed in a timely way, and of course that we know that results in children and people's plans becoming even more out of date, and we can see the impact of that on children and young people's needs being identified or met effectively. And of course we recognise why parents and carers are angry and frustrated when the plan that they've worked so hard for doesn't result in their son or daughter getting a better deal. So the second part of the slide that I hope you can see summarises the main concerns, the long-standing concerns we have about the way that the SEND system is working. Flaws, inconsistencies, delays in the identification and assessment of children and young people's needs. So we can see this problem of over and under identification. So some children and young people's needs not being identified early enough or accurately enough, but at the same time as that, some children and people being identified as having a special educational need or a disability, when in fact the difficulties they're experiencing are possibly a product of a weakness in a universal education, health or care service. And we can see over time that there hasn't been enough of a focus on that, the quality of those services that are provided to all children and young people. So the things that are, when they're done well, such as a high quality education, we know prevent some children's needs from escalating, such that they require something additional or different. But what we can also see, and it's the third bullet point on this slide, is that there remains a lack of clarity about who is responsible for what within organisations, and I think some people have called this the problem of many hands. But we can see that this results in fractures, in inconsistencies, in the way that professionals and services work together and how they interact with children, young people, and families. So these are the things that are the impact of what we see. And like you, where it's not working well, we recognise that area arrangements for identifying, assessing and meeting children and young people's needs are slow, that making sure that your son or daughter's needs are identified, assessed and met well can feel like a battle as your concerns escalate, and too often the sum of that whole process is parents and carers feeling dissatisfied with their experience of the SEND system. And in reality, in their day-to-day experience, the quality of what they and their children and young people are receiving, failing to live up with what was envisaged and expected in those children and young people's plans. I think it's also important at this point to say a little bit about recent months, and of course, absolutely no doubt that children and young people with SEND have been affected significantly by the coronavirus pandemic. You'll know that from things like the Left in Lockdown report that was published in June, that was clear about the negative impact of the disruption to education, health and care services on children and young people's friendships, their learning, their mental and physical health. The report talks about disruption to essential services combined with increasing financial pressures, leaving families feeling exhausted and anxious, some saying they felt abandoned by the rest of us. That report was also very clear about families saying that the essential services that they and their children rely on, in many cases, had stopped altogether. There were examples in that report of therapies stopping, and many reported that there have been significant delays to statutory processes, things like annual reviews, and that kind of adds to the concern about the quality and timeliness of those processes that I was already speaking about. I'm not sure that these are new problems, is what I'd say at this point. I think there's a strong argument that the pandemic has added to the significant difficulties that children and people with SEND and families are experiencing, but it's further exposed the pre-existing weaknesses in the SEND system in areas and nationally. So the cracks in the system that were there look like they've got wider and deeper. So moving on to a little bit about these interim visits, what we've been doing, what we've been learning, how that's influencing our thinking and planning for restarting inspection, moving into the new framework. As I said at the top, we've visited 6 areas already this term, and we plan to visit more in the in the spring before we restart routine inspections. The priority during these visits has been to work collaboratively with leaders in local partnerships to understand children and young people's experience, to learn from what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, for them to support local areas in the way that they prioritise and meet the needs of this group of children and young people, local authorities and CCGs in particular, and to promote learning for all local areas, for our colleagues in government, and all stakeholders through a series of national reports that we will be publishing. And at this point, I want to acknowledge and thank colleagues from NNPCF for the really productive way they worked with us on the development of the approach for these visits, the methodology, the tools that we've used during the visits, particularly those online surveys, and their contribution to the design and development of the case study activities. It's made a huge and positive difference to our work, and in many ways signals the kind of close partnership that we want to have going forward in the development of our future plans for area send inspection. So these visits, as I've said, they're collaborative, they've been inquiry based. We're trying to get an insight, an objective and evidence-based insight into what's working, to also give us some insights into when it would be the right point to restart our main programme of area send inspections. But as you know, these visits aren't inspections, and they are not a substitute for inspections either. They are not there to replace the current inspection cycle. We will restart those inspections when it's right to do so, and I'm going to come on and say a little bit about that. I thought it might be helpful just to share a few insights from these visits, but also draw on what we've learned from the visits to schools and to early years settings and to further education and skills settings, as well as some of the findings from our visits to local authority children's services and to children's social care providers, some of which are specialist providers for children and young people with a special need or disability. So some of the headlines from that, some of the headlines are we can see that children and young people with SEND and their families have struggled during the pandemic, the withdrawal of essential services, but also the loss of informal support from family and friends has had a huge impact. And what we've learned, and I think this chimes with the findings of other surveys and other work, is that families have told us that it's got harder as time has gone on. Poverty has become a greater issue for more families during the period of national restrictions. Some school leaders have talked to us about pupils experiencing higher levels of anxiety, which require additional specialist services. And we can also see that some children and young people have been adversely affected in other ways, relating to things like criminal exploitation. One of the things that we said in our first national briefing, so the briefing that we published on the 10th of November, that was that the quality of pre-existing relationships between families and practitioners appeared to be a strong determinant of their experience during the pandemic. And I think it goes back, doesn't it, to this bigger question about the central importance of working in partnership and co-production. It looked like where there was a strong culture of working in partnership, strong pre-existing relationships between families and professionals and between professionals, that had a protective effect where that wasn't the case. It left families who were perhaps already vulnerable and isolated feeling more so. But it also appeared to affect the way that children, young people and families were involved in making decisions about how best to support them during the pandemic. We saw many examples in our visits of services adapting the way they work with children, young people with SEND, and doing that in innovative and effective ways. Countless examples of individual practitioners going the extra mile, parents and carers using very warm language to speak about the work that individual practitioners have done on their behalf. We also heard some examples of where children and young people had very positive experiences during the pandemic, where the move to working online had gone well, and how things like more ready access to appointments with professionals was helping, and some children and people enjoying learning away from their school or other education setting. But we've got a concern that that many children and young people with SEND haven't returned fully to education. That if you look at levels of attendance for school-age pupils with education, health and care plans, they're consistently lower than levels of attendance for all school-age pupils in state-funded schools. We can see that attendance levels are lower for children and people who have more significant health and medical needs, or in places where over a period of time coronavirus infection rates have been higher. But we can also see that attendance has been affected by other factors, by some difficulties with transitions back into settings, problems accessing home to school transport, or that transport being provided in a suitably flexible way, and anxieties from parents and carers and children and people themselves about returning to their place of education. I guess linked to that as well, and this is a really important point, is that what we've seen is some evidence that even when children and young people have returned to their education setting, that they're not able to access the full curriculum. So part-time attendance, focus on the core subjects, some problems with implementing government guidance relating to things like hygiene requirements in some subjects, a loss of out of school and enrichment activities, and we can see that's meant that some children and young people are missing out on learning and activities that are really essential to their preparation for adult life. So practically things like access to work placements, opportunities to work and learn in other settings in the community. We can see the impact of that now, but that's something that we'd like to have a closer look at in the spring term. Some schools and education settings have said to us that children and young people aren't accessing the specialist services that they were receiving before restrictions began, or they're being delivered in different ways. In some cases those are working and in others not working. We had several examples, and particularly for children and people with more complex needs, of them having lost learning, their physical development and their development in really important areas such as communication being regressing in this time. Other examples worrying where children and people simply haven't had access to the communication systems that they rely on, both to have a voice and influence the world around them, but also to learn. I think, and again, we said this in the briefing that we published. What leaders told us in local partnerships is that they found the pace and scale of change needed during this time very challenging, and that what we're all experiencing as continued uncertainty about the progress and impact of the pandemic has made long-term planning really challenging. Practitioners have found this period challenging professionally, personally, and many have worked tirelessly. We can see that have worked tirelessly to provide the support that children, young people, and families need. Sometimes, to their own detriment personally. The feedback that we've had from these visits has been really positive, as I said, we published the first briefing in November. We plan to publish another briefing report mid-December, and that report will bring together what we've learned about the experience of children, young people with SEND and their families from all of our visits and all of our different work in Ofsted and CQC. What I would say as a very practical example is that we feel that, and be interested in your feedback on this, we feel that the case study approach, so looking more deeply at the experience of children and young people with SEND and their families, alongside getting a broader view of what it's like to be a child, young person and family in an area through surveys and other kinds of conversations has been particularly insightful. And I think that probably brings me to the next step, which is where is this all heading? And this is my final slide. So hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions, and I can see a couple of questions coming through. So looking forwards from this point, as I'm sure you're aware, we, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Children and Families, has commissioned Ofsted and CQC to develop a new area SEND inspection framework, and that would launch after the existing cycle has been completed. And that's where I started, is that in this interim period, we're focusing on how the disruption to education, health and care services impacted on children, young people and families, practitioners, leaders in areas. Next stage will be returning to routine inspection, completing the programme of area SEND inspections and revisiting areas where we have previously identified concerns. And then at the conclusion of that programme, that we would move into the new area SEND inspection framework. On the slide, I just highlighted three things that I thought it would be helpful to just give a bit of emphasis to in this session. And these were things that were included in the commission from government for this programme. What we've said is that the new framework will aim to improve the current arrangements. And again, you may have seen that on the 9th of July, when HMCI published the SEND commentary, we also published a report, an evaluation report. So looking back at the current area inspection framework and reflecting on its strengths and its limitations. So it's absolutely our intention to build on the strengths and tackle the limitations. The three things that I put on the slide, I think are really very important in relation to what the future various SEND inspections look like. The first is the intention to introduce a continuous cycle of inspection. So you'll know that the current programme is a one-off programme, And what we said in the evaluation report is that we could see that in some places that had created a kind of stop-start effect, where the impetus for improvement in an area that had sometimes built up towards an inspection or following an inspection, in some cases just hadn't been sustained, and had led, again, in some cases, to measures which were more short-term and reactive rather than long-term, strategic and embedded. So that's an important step that the commission that we have is to develop a continuous programme of inspection. We said in the evaluation report, and Amanda Spielman said in the commentary, that we want to focus much more explicitly on the experience of children, young people with SEND and their families, to have that absolutely at the core of our new approach. And I think that does represent a shift from looking at the way that area leaders have implemented the 2014 reforms and how that's impacted on children, young people and families' experiences, to putting those experiences right at the centre and working out what it is about the area arrangements that have contributed successfully to positive experiences and good outcomes, and the things that have got in the way. So it's absolutely right that that's a focus. And the third, and this links to a very general, I suppose, some very general themes about collaboration and co-production and commissioning, to take a deeper and more evidence-based look at the way that services, education, health and care services are commissioned and provided for children, young people with SEND. And again, this is where there is a really strong link with the 2014 reforms, because it's about the effectiveness of that joint commissioning cycle, and the extent to which it is really driven by, a deep understanding of what it's like to be a child or a young person with SEND, those families, and how best to provide the essential education, health and care services that they're going to need. I thought it might be helpful just to give for a few minutes, give a bit more detail about those things, and some of these things we talked about in the commentary. We think it's going to be important to look at whether all leaders in a local area have an ambitious, realistic and shared vision for children and people with SEND, for their lives now and their lives in the future, and that we can see that there is strong evidence that ambition and vision it really carries the highest levels of aspiration for those children and young people, and that it's translated into strategy and activity which is bringing about improvement. We're thinking of looking at how, as I've said, how well leaders and practitioners, children, young people and families work together to co-produce decisions about planning and commissioning, delivering services and support. And again, there's a strong link there, I think, between where I started, where we could see in areas that look like they've made better progress with tackling weaknesses, that typically improved partnership work, better collaboration, strong co-production has featured significantly in that improvement. We want to take a look at the quality of, as I've said, a quality of universal services, but also targeted and specialist services in an area. So to make sure that we're thinking about and looking at the things that protect and prevent children, young people from needing something additional or different when they're working well. So those very early stages of the graduated approach, as it's set out in the code of practice. And I suppose in effect, in all of those things, what we are thinking about what we want to understand better is the extent to which children, young people and families are getting the right help and support at the right time. The last thing that we're thinking about and looking at the moment is the extent to which all of this builds towards something that is meaningful and aspirational for children, young people with SEND and their families. The extent to which the sum of everything that happens is really preparing those children, young people in the best possible way for their lives as young adults and adults. And we think that needs to be a strong and central feature of what happens going forward. But as well as looking forward, as I've said, we also want to make sure that we learn from what we've done already. In the first programme of area inspections, but also we think it's absolutely essential that we learn from the things that children, young people themselves and their families tell us about what is working well for them and what needs to be better. You know, if our approach is going to measure an area's effectiveness against the things that make the biggest difference for children, young people and families, then we've got to be confident that the things that we focus on in these inspections are actually the things that make the biggest difference for children, young people and families. And we recognise that it's going to be essential to take time to listen and understand children, young people's experiences, parents and carers' experiences, alongside everything else that we've learned in recent years to get to that clarity and focus. We also want to think about what other stakeholders tell us about their experience, what works, what doesn't work, and make sure that our approach to inspection achieves those primary purposes of supporting improvement and development and holding leaders to account. And we can see that there are some particular challenges to that in a system that is that operates across different organisations, local authorities, CCGs, and every provider partner in education, health and care in an area. We've got to make that work well. But we also want to make sure that we really learn from the wider base of inspection and regulation work that we do in social care in Ofsted, in early years, in schools, further education and skills, and what we learn from the way that we work with our colleagues in the Care Quality Commission, and also what we can learn from other models of inspection and regulation work. So things like the joint targeted area inspections, the JTIs, and our inspections of local authority children's services. But I guess, and this is my final point really, and then I'll try and work my way through the questions for a few minutes, if that would be helpful. We want all of our visits and inspection activities to improve the lives of children, young people with SEND. That is our primary purpose. We want them to be well prepared for education, for employment, for independent living, to be as visible and active in the way that they participate in society, and to have the healthiest life possible. And we are going to take time to listen to you, to listen to other parents and carers, to listen to children, young people, so that in the arrangements that we're developing for this new area SEND inspection, we focus on the things that make the biggest difference to children, young people's lives, and to your lives. Okay, gosh, that was a lot of talking, wasn't it? And a lot of listening for you. So I hope some of that was interesting and relevant. I'm just wondering whether it might be useful just to have a look at the questions and see which ones I can answer and which ones might need to pick up separately. And if there are other questions, other things that you'd like to ask in the 10 minutes or so that we've got left, that would be great. Should we be encouraging parents to report concerns to Ofsted and CQC, as the threshold for LGSCO reporting is so high, many failures do not get reported or picked up during audits? What I would say on that is that I think there's a broad picture with that, isn't there, which is that the routes of redress for parents and carers, as they're set out in the code, parents and carers often tell us are unclear and difficult to navigate. What we find is where parents and carers are able to raise their concerns at an early stage, with providers in the area in the first instance, follow those local processes, get the help and support they need from others in the area. And we see Sendias and other services having a big role in this. That has greater effect. I would always encourage a family to raise their concerns when we're inspecting or revisiting areas. We do our very best to take time to listen and to hear about those concerns. Our ability to act on individual concerns, as you know, is very limited, but what we are able to do is look at those cases and consider them alongside everything else that we learn when we're inspecting. The next question: many families found they could not access school summer term despite education, health and care plans. Reasons given: staff shortages, staff shielding, delayed risk assessments. Some children prefer home education. So a range of factors. How is Ofsted going to assist schools, colleges in closing the attainment gap? What a brilliant question, thank you. That's been one of the things that we focused on in our visits to schools during this time, and the dialogue with leaders has partly been about what's happened in the past, but also about plans for the future. And obviously a key part of that, and I talked a little bit about it, is what's the curriculum like for children and young people with SEND and others right now. So what's being taught, how is it being taught, what's working and what's not working. And clearly our job in this, one of our jobs in this, has been to find out about those things, to share what we've learned with school leaders, with leaders in local areas, but more broadly through our national reports. And in the report that we're going to publish mid-December, you'll see a lot more about children and young people's experience of returning to school. And in the spring term, what we're planning to focus on are, so what are the challenges going forward, given that we've said very publicly that some children and young people have really suffered as a result of this pandemic and the disruption it's caused. Second question: are Ofsted aware of increase in exclusions? Excuse mass mobility for getting one way. Yeah. This being applied to children with additional needs, presently collating this data. Well, I mean, again, thanks for that question, Caroline. And if you have any additional insights into that, if you've got individual examples or data about what that looks like in an area, be really interesting to have a conversation with you outside of this session, if you're able to. What we have seen are the impact of a range of factors, so things that have helped children and young people return successfully, things that have got in the way. And I probably didn't explain it clearly enough, but one consistent factor in supporting children and young people's successful return to education, and cases where there've been really sometimes quite subtle but very important adaptations made for the child or young person, was the quality of the dialogue and communication between the setting and the child or young person and family throughout the period of the pandemic, and where that had been consistent and really of good quality, that we can see how that had supported, making the right decisions about what to adapt, but also putting that into practice well. Where inspectors find a written statement of action is required, how do you quality control this? Having recently worked in ours, it's very evident that there's a difference in the quality and expectation. How do you plan to ensure that it's not a postcode lottery on a national level? So though those plans, when they're drafted, come to the Chief Inspector, we evaluate those plans. We judge them to be fit for purpose or not fit for purpose. If we judge them to be fit for purpose, we often identify development points within those plans. So things, this plan is fit for purpose, but there are some things about the plan that can be strengthened. If we judge them not to be fit for purpose, we explain exactly why and what needs to be improved. The partnership then has a further 20 days to resubmit it, and we evaluate it again. What I would say is that the real test here is what difference does doing the things that are in that plan make to children, young people and families in that area? And that's exactly the approach that we take when we revisit an area 18 to 24 months after the initial inspection. Based on what we found at the initial inspection, the plans that leaders have created, the actions that they've taken, is there strong evidence that those plans are on track, they're being implemented well, and is there tangible evidence of the impact of what has been done on the quality of services children, young people and families experience. Yes, lots of talking, but excellent. Thank you for that bit of feedback. Very nice. So you made the point about quality of leadership, how realistic it is to ask them to plan how to address issues. Yeah, really good question, Ruth. And again, this is where, if you look as well, if you look in the back of our Area Send Inspection Handbook, it sets out who some of the other players in these arrangements are. So the role of Department for Education advisors, NHS England advisors, and how they both support and challenge leaders in a local area, on the back of us requiring them to produce and submit a written statement of action. So it's not just about our assessment of it, it's about how that triggers additional support and challenge from others. How many local areas are to be visited? How many visits are planned in the second round? Is it 2 per month? Doesn't quite work like that, Anna, I'm sorry, if only. So there are 34 areas that haven't been inspected that we will inspect, and several that we will revisit. We'll schedule those, sequence those in a way which uses the resource that we have to best effect, is probably what I would say, but they tend not to follow that kind of pattern. There are lots of other factors that we need to consider, such as how does this inspection sit alongside other inspection and regulation work that we do in Ofsted. Please, can there be a focus on complaints process for send? Complaints aren't finalised, often hidden, third party provide, yeah. Again, I think that's a really helpful point to make. To be noted, and perhaps alongside many other things, something that needs to be considered as part of what's happening with the review of the send system regulations and guidance. So thank you for that. I've made a note of that. Who can parents turn to when the local SENDIAS is given incorrect information leading to a safeguarding issue? Areas of lost trust in the system, and parents don't want. Yeah, and I mean, what we often hear in our inspections and revisits are SENDIAS and the Parent Carer Forum are a complete lifeline for families. So I can absolutely see where, if there are concerns about how those things are working in an area, how it might leave parents and carers feeling even more vulnerable But I'm wondering if that maybe is an individual issue that it might be wiser to pick up separately, Debbie, and I'd be happy to do that afterwards or separately. Length of a local area inspection doesn't give sufficient time for inspectors to gain a good overview of the area. And again, a very good question. I think and the reason why, given that we have the resource that we have, the resource that we will have to inspect an area in completing the current cycle and the new cycle, how we make sure that we use that to best effect, that we really focus on the things that make the biggest difference to children, young people and families' lives. Please can they focus on key workers? I'm from an area where they don't have any. This creates an uphill fight for families. So Rhiannon, I think you and I are on exactly the same page with this, that I've been spent a big chunk of my career as a Senko in a school, as a senior leader, as a special school head teacher for a chunk of time. I could really see the difference that those individuals make, and sometimes mediating what can feel like a very complex and rather unwieldy system for parents and carers. I can see how they're a really important source of help and advice, and I can also see how they have a really significant role in coordinating the work of others. I think I would probably describe some of the best of what I have seen during the period of the pandemic as key working, where a professional that parents and carers trust, someone they have confidence in, has been that person who's kept in touch regularly and really helped to make good child family centred decisions about the support they need, and then mediated that well through other people. So brilliant question. Children being sent home to self-isolate where there's no support, missing out on education. How can we make sure all children have the same access to education? I think that highlights a very fundamental challenge about how is it possible to replicate the quality of what the best settings are providing, whether it's specialist equipment, resources, a high quality curriculum, adults who have the necessary skills, qualifications, experience to support their learning and development at home. And HMCI said yesterday, and I can see from the visits that we've done, that in many cases there is just simply no substitute for a really high quality specialist education for children and young people, and anything less than that is going to sell them short. Please can we tread more carefully with forums through inspection? Through them under a book. I mean, Rhiannon, again, I think we absolutely get you are often on a knife edge between those things in your relationships with with the families that you are there to serve, but also with local authority and CCG and other leaders in the area. It's a hugely challenging role, and if there are occasions when we don't treat that with enough sensitivity, then we need to do that better. Because as a starting point, I think we recognise the complexity, the importance and the complexity of what we do. Oh, thank you, Amy. Great to see you again, and informative as ever. Brilliant. I'll take that one away. Maureen, will you be doing trials? Yes, definitely. Definitely, we'll be. Have plans to pilot parts of the programme, the whole programme, and we'll be looking for people to help us with that. Absolutely essential. Please be careful with your providers. A lot of providers are long-standing, haven't been through a tendering process yet. And again, also, we get that block commissioning arrangements that have operated over a long period of time, that it's been difficult to adapt. We know that improving commissioning takes a while. What I wouldn't compromise, though, in any respect, would be that sort of thread of between an absolutely clear understanding of what it's like to be a child or young person with SEND, a deep understanding of the difficulties and needs that those children and young people experience, an understanding of their talents and strengths and how they can be, you know, how they can be nurtured, and good child-centered, needs-led decisions about what services are commissioned. When you inspect, will you use a new framework or one that you originally inspected? Good question. For the remainder of this inspection programme, this cycle, the first 151 inspections, we will use the existing framework, and we will develop a new framework and handbook for the future Area SEND framework. Oh, hello, Kath, nice to see you there. You mentioned quality leadership with degree, the lack of funding for training practitioners and co-production. Yeah, I mean, I think there's, Kath, what I'd say is that I'm just not sure that, you know, if I think about the period since, you know, the Value in People, you know, white paper, the Value in People project, you know, all the early work that was done through things like the Lamb Inquiry, the Green Paper, Support and Aspirations Green Paper, the 2014 reforms. I suppose I'm not convinced that there, even as a starting point, there is a strong enough understanding of what co-production actually means, what it looks like in practice, what the features of really effective co-production are like, what it feels like to children, young people and families when it's working well, and that collectively we do our best to replicate that wherever possible. Will the level of continuous inspections be the same going forward? Yeah, so yeah, I mean, again, Sylvia, I completely get that. The sort of, you know, the stop-start nature of the current programme, we absolutely get as being a you know, a limiting, hugely limiting factor in this, and we want to take a much more systematic approach in the future. Will Ofsted SEND contribute to short break services debate? I think yes, definitely. We said some things about short breaks in the November briefing. I hope we're going to have more to say about short breaks. Again, for me, and you know, I suppose this is more from my own experience, you know, from my time as a head, can really see for children, young people themselves and families how crucial, you know, a high quality, universal and targeted and specialist short break offer is in a local area, and how important is that whatever short break resources there is used in a way which really makes sense for the child, young person and family, and connects that resource into, you know, into other things that are happening in their lives. So yeah, important that we're part of that debate. Yeah, a shout out for Matthew Barnes. Thanks for that, Ruth. I will make sure Matthew gets that message. Really appreciate you giving him some nice feedback. Will social care have more of a focus? Absolutely, yes, Katie, definitely. So we were, you know, unequivocal in the evaluation report about the limitations of not having, you know, social care, enough of a focus on the social care and social care contribution to the education health arrangements in the current framework. We just said that very clearly. And of course, in the interim visits, we've had social care colleagues. We've had social care colleagues on the visit teams with us, and I think that heralds, you know, something new and different and better in the future, and certainly feedback from those colleagues and my own reflections and those of leaders and practitioners in partnerships is that it really added something positive having them with us. So great. Georgina's saying, I can't see the questions, will they be sent out to? I'm guessing there will be. I'm not completely sure, but Helen might help with that. Wow, those have been real. Thank you. At the beginning there, I could only see 3 questions, and it's turned out to be quite a lot. So I hope that's been helpful. Having 20 minutes to chew over those for a little bit. Helen, can I thank you and colleagues in Contact and then NPCF for asking me today. It's a real privilege to have an hour with this group. I hope it's been helpful, you know, at a very basic level, and I hope it just signals the importance to us of having these conversations with you and taking time to listen and learn from your experience. That's absolutely at the heart of what we're about in Ofsted and CQC. So unless there's anything else, Helen, I think it's probably time for a cuppa.
Thank you very much for all of your time today, Nick. Very much appreciated.
Super. Take care, everybody. Look after yourselves.